Picture this. You're not just running from the law, you're itching. Not metaphorically, but literally scratching at your scalp, feeling something crawling under your shirt while every patch of skin stings with old sweat and God knows what. The movies focus on Tommy guns, getaway cars, and that baby-faced glare. But what if the real misery of outlaw life was something way more primal? Today, we dive right into the gross, the bodily, and the taboo. Did Babyface Nelson actually suffer lice, sores, and the everyday filth that came with living on the run? Forget the glamorous shootouts. We're talking the kind of discomfort you can't escape with a fast car. But before we start scratching in sympathy, let's get specific. Many people imagine that outlaws, especially ones hunted by the entire FBI, must have been filthy by default. But what would it actually take to prove that Babyface Nelson had lice, or skin sores, or was even noticeably dirtier than the next guy? To move past vibes and movie stereotypes, we'd need something real, like an arrest record noting prisoner infested with lice, a medical file describing skin lesions, or even a period witness saying Nelson had open sores or a greasy scalp. Anything less is just guesswork. So, are there any documents or eyewitnesses who actually noticed, recorded, or complained about the state of Nelson's skin? Of course, we all know how these stories usually go. Concrete proof of outlaw misery is hard to come by. Still, you might wonder, even if nobody wrote down Nelson itched through his last bank robbery, could we at least use the era's context to get close to an answer? Was it normal for a fugitive to be crawling with lice, or is that just our modern imagination running wild? If the direct proof is missing, maybe the background of the 1930s, the squalid hideouts, and weeks without safe shelter could point us toward what was likely, if not certain. But first, let's try the straightforward approach and see what's actually in the record. Here's what the evidence really says. No supplied transcript, no jail record, and no period account directly confirms that Babyface Nelson ever had lice, visible skin sores, or any specific hygiene disaster. There's nothing in the contemporary sources that says Nelson brought fleas into the cell, or arresting officers recoiled at his smell. Not a single medical note or police statement in the surviving documents describes him with open wounds from scratching, or even comments on his general cleanliness. The record is just blank on this point. So if you were hoping for a dramatic report of the FBI's most wanted man being brought down by a bad case of bedbugs, the documents force us to look elsewhere, or scratch that idea off the list. So, faced with the silence of the record, we're left scratching our heads, maybe not our scalps, about what Babyface Nelson was really dealing with under that infamous mop of hair. The hope for a dramatic, he was crawling with lice headline just runs up against a wall. No matter how many times you check the mug shots or FBI transcripts, you won't find a line about Nelson's itching, or a sullen agent complaining about the smell left on a cell bench. It's an odd reality of outlaw history. The government documented bullets, bodies, and bank robberies, but not whether the country's most wanted was also the country's itchiest. That means, if we want to get at the truth of Nelson's physical misery, we have to look to the era, what the life of a fugitive was like for anyone when the cameras and headlines weren't around. In 1930s America, the conditions that came standard with outlaw life weren't just dangerous, they were downright filthy. The facts show that lice, skin infections, and general disease were common among fugitives constantly on the move. If you weren't shot or caught, you still had to outlast the invisible enemies. Body lice in your collar, bed bugs in the mattress, if you had one. And whatever germs lurked in the communal safe houses or abandoned barns. Getting clean wasn't just a luxury. Sometimes it was simply impossible. Running from the law meant running from soap and water, too. Sticking it out in some unheated shack outside Chicago, you'd be lucky not to pick up a few passengers in your hair or under your shirt. So, while there's no report of Nelson scratching at a police lineup, the odds of going months lice-free were slim for anyone in his world. And the grime wasn't just a side effect. It was the main event. Nelson's reality as a fugitive meant sleeping in dirty hideouts, rarely seeing a proper bed, and enduring the cold, hunger, and deprivation that went with the job. The only thing more common than a loaded gun was a pile of dirty laundry, if you were lucky enough to have spare clothes at all. Hiding out didn't mean luxury. It meant shivering nights on bare floorboards, eating whatever you could scrounge, and washing only as often as the risk allowed. Imagine a notorious outlaw, once dressed sharp for a robbery, now sharing a single crumbling room with his gang. The windows covered, the air stale, and the only bathwater being the rain that seeped through the roof. In that world, misery was as constant as the threat of arrest. Given all that, it's highly plausible that wounds, poor sleep, and a lack of bathing made the risk of skin sores, infections, and general bodily breakdown almost unavoidable. Even a minor scrape could turn ugly when you hadn't washed for a week and your immune system was running on black coffee and adrenaline. If lice and bed bugs didn't get you, the endless cycle of exhaustion, stress, and bad shelter easily could. This isn't the fantasy of the charming outlaw. It's the grimy, sleep-deprived, and unwashed version history tends to gloss over. So, while the files don't say Nelson reeked of sweat and scabs, the era's everyday misery would have been right there with him, every uncomfortable step of the way. Imagine, then, the physical reality of hiding out as a fugitive in the 1930s. You're jammed into a cramped safe house with 3 or 4 gang members, every window blocked by old quilts, with only the faintest draft sneaking in. You haven't properly bathed in days, maybe weeks. The only water is for drinking, not washing, and there's no one to impress but each other, and the ever-present smell of sweat and old socks. Your scalp itches constantly. The gritty, greasy hair sticks to your forehead. Under your shirt, the skin crawls, sometimes literally, as lice or bed bugs make themselves at home in your seams and folds. You scratch until small sores open, trying to find relief, but it only makes things worse. At night, every movement on the blanket could be a bug, or just your nerves. There's no clean change of clothes, just a rotation of increasingly stiff shirts and damp socks. The only outlaw grooming tip left is to shake out your coat and hope nothing falls out that's alive. When you do finally sleep, it's with the ache of run-down muscles and the itch of skin that's forgotten what clean feels like. So, even though we don't have a police report saying Babyface Nelson was covered in lice, the brutal logic of outlaw life fills in the blanks. The misery was inescapable. Hunger, filth, infection, constant fear. If Nelson didn't suffer lice or sores, he would have been one of the few lucky exceptions, not the rule. The myth of the itchy, aching fugitive isn't just a Hollywood exaggeration. It's a natural outgrowth of what we know. The body breaks down quickly under stress, filth, and fear. Even the most infamous criminals couldn't outshoot bedbugs or sweat through a wall, and Nelson's legend, at its core, matches the messier, more physical truth hiding beneath the nicknames and headline. But here's a twist. If you actually go looking through the old newspapers, police files, or early accounts, you won't find any direct source saying Nelson specifically had lice, skin disease, or was found caked in dirt. The lice myth doesn't show up in the period record. Instead, it lurks in recent retellings, true crime podcasts, and the collective imagination, a detail that feels so right for the era it just keeps getting repeated, regardless of documentation. What this really means is that the story of Babyface Nelson's bodily misery was shaped less by witnesses or hard evidence and more by the way we picture outlaws on the run. Media, movies, and our own expectations fill in the gaps. The myth sticks because it's so believable, dirty, desperate, itching, and aching. In the end, it's not a detail pulled from a police report, but an idea born from what we know about the cost of living outside the law when soap and safety were both in short supply. So, after all that, what do we actually have? The myth of Babyface Nelson scabbed up, itching, and crawling with lice isn't a fact we can pin down in a police file. It's more like a cultural echo, a kind of vivid, plausible misery that feels real because we know what life on the run did to everyone else. Our brains fill in the gaps. If every outlaw slept rough, skipped baths, and scrambled from one dirty hideout to the next, of course the itching and sores would follow. The story persists, not because we found a louse in Nelson's hair, but because it fits what we believe about desperate men living desperate lives. In that sense, the lice and sores are part legend, part common sense, less a direct report, more an interpretive shudder passed down through retelling. We keep scratching at the idea because, beneath the myth, there's a bodily truth about what being an outlaw did to the human animal. And that physical misery, itchy skin, open sores, greasy hair, the stink of sweat layered over gunpowder wasn't just a footnote for outlaws of Nelson's era. Even if we don't have a record of Nelson's own lice or abscesses, fugitives in his position were likely miserable in exactly those ways. The constant discomfort shaped their decisions, their health, even their ability to survive. Hygiene wasn't just about dignity. It was about not scratching open a wound that could get infected, about not getting so infested that you couldn't sleep or think straight. When your nerves are shot and your scalp is crawling, it's a lot harder to pull off your next escape or keep your fingers steady on a trigger. In other words, the gritty, itching reality changed the actual course of outlaw lives far more than any movie makeover. When you picture Babyface Nelson in his last days, imagine that behind the headlines and the bravado, the real battle was against his own body, as much as against the law. Which brings us to the responsible bodily truth. Just because we can't stamp lice or sores in Nelson's permanent record, that doesn't mean he escaped the discomfort and misery the myth describes. The absence of direct proof isn't an eraser. It's just a boundary. The lice and sores story works, not as strict fact, but as a vivid stand-in for a body under siege. If nothing else, the myth has interpretive value. It forces us to imagine the outlaw, not as a legend in clean pinstripes, but as a tired, scratching, suffering human, shaped by every mile of running, every dirty shirt, every sleepless, itching night. So, if you want to reframe Babyface Nelson's story, don't picture a polished gangster untouchable by dirt and disease. Even if the details are half legend, the odds are his reality was a lot messier, filthy, aching, and probably scratching at a rash under his collar. The myth sticks because it reveals an outlaw who could be undone not just by bullets, but by the misery of his own flesh. Hollywood may hide the filth, but the body keeps the score. In the end, if you scratch beneath the surface of outlaw history, you'll find more than gunfights and getaways. You'll find the itch and the ache, the real bodily cost that legends tend to leave out.